I'm Will Prince, the Director of Membership and Development with the Louisiana Trust. Today we're and continue our ongoing video series that's been made possible through the Division of Historic Preservation and the National Park Service. Today's conversation is focusing on diversity. Today we'll be talking with historian Jeffrey Free Harris on ways to recognize, interpret, and celebrate diversity in the world of historic preservation and at historic sites. And in many ways to start the conversation of how to deal with challenging issues and events in our history. Before we get started, first off, Free, could you tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Sure. Again, my name is Jeffrey Harris. I'm known in the preservation world by my nickname of Free. I'm a Hampton, Virginia-based independent historian and historic preservation consultant. I also serve on the Board of Historic Resources for the Commonwealth of Virginia, and I am also the current board chair for the Rainbow Heritage Network, an organization that is focused on the preservation of LGBTQ historic places across the country. And currently right now, my personal mission is to focus a little bit more attention on music-related historic places, and I've been in the process of putting together a rather sizable database of the country's music-related historic sites. But I also do, the sort of standard things that one does as a consultant. I've worked on National Register nominations. I've worked with organizations dealing with historic reinterpretations of their historic sites. I've also worked with individual organizations on board development, re-examining how to increase access to diversity, how to expand audiences. So, it's sort of a number of things, and it's related to my past work with the National Trust for Historic Preservation, where for 6 years I started as an intern, became what they used to call an intern success story, having run their African American Historic Places initiative for a couple of years, and then moving up to becoming the organization's first director for diversity. And it was through that particular job that I realized that I could be a consultant and talk more, openly and more thoroughly about the idea of diversity within the preservation movement.
Great. So on the topic of diversity and recognizing all these elements, what are some of the first steps that preservationists or historians can take to better identify and recognize different and distinct cultures associated with their sites or in the general preservation effort as a whole?
Sure. I think I'll use Louisiana as a good starting point for this. Louisiana already has a rich and varied history with Native American, African, French, Spanish, American, cultures already embedded within the state's history. And then you move forward to the more recent past and you add in, Hispanic, Latinx, and Asian Americans, to that story. And you already have, dare I say, a rich gumbo of things to choose from with regard to, Louisiana's history. And, many states across the country have these really already existing diverse stories with which they can really pull from. And I think that it is important for preservationists to remember the idea of history in the historic preservation part first and use that history that we know of as their guidepost to engaging the preservation aspect of what it is that they do. So the other thing that I often recommend to anyone dealing with issues of diversity is to abandon fear when looking at actual histories of historic places. You've got to abandon fear. History is, we know that history has triumphs and it has tragedies and everything in between. And, we have to begin the process of being able to embrace that which is uncomfortable. Because I think often in doing so, we find that some of the most interesting history that then can be shared with the broader public exists within those sort of uncomfortable spaces. And in terms of dealing with that, and in terms of work as in terms of being preservationist, it really can give us solid challenges that will help us do better as we encounter, more and different changing aspects of the work that we do as preservationists.
Yeah, looking at all the elements, but also looking beyond what we know, and like you said, abandoning the fear and looking deeper into that. That's a great point. Um, so once you have identified some of those different cultures and things like that, whether historically or even present day, what have been some successful community outreach efforts that you have seen or used to address and engage diversity at the sites or within the communities?
I often use as an excellent example the whole effort across the South to preserve Rosenwald schools. And for those who may not be familiar with Rosenwald schools, though there were plenty in Louisiana, Julius Rosenwald was the chair of Sears and Roebuck, and he worked with Booker T. Washington, the famous Booker T. Washington, to invest in African American education across the South, so that it brought together funding from Rosenwald's foundation with individual African American communities across the South to build schools. And the effort that had come from individuals who are the descendants of those who attended Rosenwald schools, or those who actually are still, who were lucky enough to actually go to school in them, there was an effort across the region not only to identify and preserve these places, but so many of them were in rural communities that it gave I think, a wonderful introduction to some people who may not necessarily have thought about preservation generally into what, the mechanics of preserving an historic site. And it became, I think, a great example of African American preservation, rural American preservation, and looking at communities that may not have a great deal of money, but willing to put in the effort to do the hard work of preserving an historic place. And I think that is one of those examples of a diverse story coming to fore, that opened up opportunities for the communities where those Rosenwald schools are, to talk more broadly about larger issues dealing with civil rights that came later, issues dealing with race and community change, and what's happening if a neighborhood is going through a process of change. So it sort of, in a way, I felt like that opened doors to having other discussions related to, specifically in African American context, topics in terms of that line of diversity. Another example has been, I think, a really good effort among the LGBTQ preservation community to really get its history recognized and landmarked across the board. It's been fascinating to see different communities come through with just the effort of making sure that the whole idea of anything LGBT or Q wouldn't scare people away from the actual history that was done. People being a bit nervous that, making an effort to preserve that history would trigger, a bad response. And for lack of a better way of putting it, it hasn't so far, thankfully. And what we've gotten has been a slow, really slow, but expanding number of historic places with an LGBTQ tie that are being recognized, including a slow expansion of things that are on the National Register of Historic Places, a couple of National Historic Landmarks. But it also has prompted some places to look at hidden histories that people had not thought about before, where we've since learned about an LGBTQ presence in a place that is already sort of a noted place, and being able to go back and look at reinterpreting that history to include that once hidden story. So I think those are a couple of examples that really come to mind. Another thing, and this is again because of my interest in music, I think that the idea of looking at our music-related historic places automatically opens you up to a range of diversity. So, you could look at Zydeco-related historic places in Louisiana, Cajun music-related historic places, jazz, blues, rock and roll, country. And you see where you automatically, just looking at that one subject area, music,
Yeah.
you just open yourself up to a huge range of
And
what
I've,
can be considered diverse.
and I've seen through kind of on the community revitalization end, some small towns, they might not have a lot of activities or a lot of historic resources, but when they pull in music or whether it's a concert or some type of ongoing series, that gets people back to the community, gets them interested, and gets them talking about the place, the site, the history, and gets people engaged with each other. So it's definitely a connector.
Yeah, and what's good about that too is that if harnessed properly, then you can begin the process of really building a preservation ethic in individuals who may not necessarily have thought of themselves as preservationists. I jokingly say that with music fans, you have the option, like you do with sports fans, of really developing future preservationists, even if they wouldn't necessarily say that. But you love your concert venue, you love your artist, you love
Mm-hmm.
your sports team, and you want to see things related to them preserved if they can be. So we just have to make an effort as preservation professionals to say, well, hey, look, if you like this, what about
Yeah.
here's the net, it's sort of like, it's like an entry into our field. And it's good because we need that type of constituency building, so that when we do have larger preservation challenges coming through, we can tap into those folks that we've engaged through things that they really did enjoy, in terms of, saving a school or saving a music site or saving a sports site. And they have a better understanding of what it is that we're doing. So it doesn't seem quite as mysterious, if you will. It doesn't seem alien or foreign.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's a case of finding their interest, be it the sports, be it the LGBT, be it the school, the music, and finding the way that, they want to continue to see that appreciated and exposing the bigger preservation elements of, how that can happen, whether it's landmarking or just storytelling and how to connect that into the community.
Right. It's meeting people where they are, and providing them a sense of how you can contextualize a history that they have, that they're tied to, a history that they appreciate already.
And I think that ties us next pretty well into our next question. So Louisiana has a mix of historic sites that are open to the public for tours, educational field trips ranging from entire neighborhoods, plantations, history and house museums, and a plethora of many more from small towns to major cities. In some cases, interpretive elements are taken from old National Register nominations or when the site was originally built. How can these sites be better interpreted to share the stories or different people or different time periods? What are some examples you've seen, or what have you seen that have been trends or great examples that could be applied to an everyday house museum or some of the larger facilities here in Louisiana?
Again, I go back to the idea of re-engaging or re-examining the history of those places. That could be something that could be done by working with, say, an academic institution and getting a bevy of students, convince a professor to have their students be assigned doing some historical research on a particular historic site that deals with the history that they have, so that the people who run those particular places know what it is that they're dealing with. It takes a
Mm-hmm.
great deal of time and effort to do some of those things. And we know that historic sites, there are very few historic sites that have, say, an in-house historian who can dedicate all of their energy and time. That's the only thing that they do is, look at the history of the site. Everybody's usually having to do 50 different things in order to make a site, keep it running. Um, engage those other, engage sort of companion institutions, again, if you will, to help create a synergy between an historic site, say, and an academic institution. And I
Mm-hmm.
speak specifically about that because the African American Historic Places Initiative that I worked on at the National Trust for Historic Preservation looks specifically at ways that academic institutions could work with African American historic places, not only to build site capacity, but also to look at really helping those types of places get a better grip on its history so that they could then present a more full-bodied story to audiences that they would engage. And I would recommend thinking of doing something similar, with the historic places there. And again, there are going to be challenges. There are going to be there will be sticky things. I mean, we are talking about a southern state. We're talking about a southern state. We know that issues of race and slavery and Jim Crow, all of those things, Native American removal, women being in different, the differentiations with regard to women from, white women who may have been held on pedestals in places to Black women who worked to, newer history, Asian American and Latina, Latinx, Hispanic, just different things coming into play, and not being afraid of that, because I still firmly believe that properly engaging that history and then putting that information out to an audience will help to strengthen an historic place's position. And it will give the people who are running those places, I feel at least, a greater confidence in being able to engage, the tough things that we have to deal with in terms of the preservation movement. I hope that is getting a little close to answering your question.
Yeah, I think as you kind of say, building off of that, becoming more of an expert of knowing your site in its full sense, and building that and educating the public, whether it be through an interpretive panel or adding a new element to a tour, starts to build those relationships and starts to better understand, the 1800s and the 1900s and how they different, but how that makes that place so special in different ways, whether it's, congratulatory or some of the more challenging issues we struggle with.
And here I'll give an example, and I will admit I'm veiling the example somewhat, but there was an historic place that I worked with, and the director of that site proved to be particularly resistant to a very important component of that site's history. And following my recommendations of, here are ways to engage this particular aspect of your site's history, and here are opportunities that may come as a result of focusing a little more attention on that particular bit of history. The director of the site said point blank, I'm not going to do that. And when I asked, well, why would you not? You brought me in to provide you with recommendations of how to engage, this African American aspect of your history. I've given you a recommendation that I think is pretty solid, since the goal was for the site to then engage African American audiences or potential partners. But you're now telling me that you don't want to deal with a specific aspect of African American history tied to your site and tied to the person who is, for whom your site is named. You don't want to do this. That makes no sense at all. And I wouldn't want any other historic place, whatever the subject is, to find itself in a similar position. And I still hold that site is still doesn't do it, but that site is less rich for not engaging that, and has lost out. I am more than sure, this has been more than 10 years ago, has lost out on opportunities to do, I think, really creative and interesting things with regard to expanded interpretations, potential collaborations, giving everybody involved a better understanding of that particular, the person associated with that particular site, and that particular person's sort of broader relationship within a better historical context. I mean, as a real, it was shocking, to be quite honest, even to the point where there was something that I recommended that everyone who worked at that site watch, that was relevant to the site. And there was absolute resistance from the director about even seeing, like, oh, I haven't seen that. And I'm like, wait a minute, how have you not seen this? This is something that the person tied to your site is known for. Like, random people could tell you that person is associated with that, and you yourself have never seen this. So it still remains shocking. And I would strongly recommend not being afraid of that history. Just go ahead and bite that bullet, because the rewards for engaging it, I think, are greater than the comfort that one has for not having engaged it in the first place.
All right. I think those are all the questions I have for today. Is there anything else you would like to add before we finish here?
Again, it's the historian in me. I can't help it. I always want people to do a better job of really looking at the historic information that is in front of them. Again, the very purpose of historic preservation is for people to be able to engage the history of a particular place. And the best way of doing that is for those places to really deal honestly and openly with the history of the place that they are in charge of, that they are responsible for. To leave something behind, to ignore something that's there, or to not do the due diligence, at the very least, of being able to find out if there is history that you don't know, even if you can't get to it right at that moment, but at least you know it. You've got to embrace that, because in the end, your audience needs that information from you. I don't care if you're talking about a redevelopment project in a city that is going to do wonders for revitalizing a community, or if it's, a plantation site where you just want to have a better sense of what happened on that plantation site over time. You need to be able to use that history as your talisman, as your guide, as your friend. History is your friend. Historic preservation. It really is. So
great. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, and
it's my pleasure. All right, thank you very much for inviting me to share.